Hello friends, thanks for checking out the video. Be sure to like and subscribe as it greatly helps out the channel and I'd really appreciate it. Enjoy!
Yeah, I'd say so. I mean, and you bring, as someone who loves history, right, the whole historical context behind Europe, discuss the feudal societies, but just how this kind of social interaction and networking is so ingrained. It's been, centuries over there, and kind of how we still see, how has that still been passed down? And I guess, would you say that was kind of like the goal of your study, was just to see how these differing social networking, right? It's, despite distance and proximity and number of interactions, right, were kind of varying, and how telling they were on being beneficial to older adults and combating something like loneliness.
Yeah, so we wanted to basically boil down people's networks into these different kind of ideal types, and to see whether, kind of looking across the continent of Europe, is there some kind of a consistency where you see kind of the breakdown of, some people have really close by networks, some people have networks that are far more geographically expanded. And one of the thoughts that we had was that we would see a lot more of the sort of close by networks common in Southern Europe as well as Eastern Europe. Whereas we thought we'd see more expansive, more elastic types of networks in places like Northern Europe and Western Central Europe. And that was borne out quite a bit in the data. We did see that there was kind of this split between those two kind of broad regions of the continent. But we also did find that even in places like Greece and Spain and Italy, that there was, even there, quite a bit of geographical spread too for people's networks. So there is actually diversity, not just between different regions, but also within different regions of Europe.
Makes sense. I think that's really cool. Really kind of enlightening, because again, I think many of the viewers might see it as, European countries, especially Greece, right, have certain ideologies on those being very, yes, family oriented, but all close by, within country. Like, no one really moves or explores too far outside of where they were born. I mean, that's to an extent a general trend, just at least here in the US, right? As a lot of people live and die, was it like within 5 miles of where they were born or where they moved? So, something crazy like that, just kind of highlighting how individuals may not be so akin to moving, but especially that might seem or would be believed to be more apparent in Europe. So very interesting that that's not necessarily the case, and that, the kind of health implications that can have on something like loneliness is, kind of what you were getting at with, so chat, again, feel free to ask questions anytime if you have any. And, as we get into these results, kind of looking at what y'all finding, and Markus, I know you already started, we're beginning to touch on them, but the first one that, I kind of have that stood out to me was, you talk about mid-range and distant family networks that lack a discussant nearby. So chat, basically, right? So someone not necessarily in the household, yet they still sustain a high emotional closeness with family discussants or members at a distance, and they still express high overall satisfaction with their network. So my question to you is, what kind of explains that? Is it, again, the improvements in technology like Zoom and Teams that's allowed for that high level of satisfaction to sustain itself?
Yeah, I really wish that we would have conducted this study once kind of Zoom had really proliferated like it had during the pandemic. So that our data actually come just a couple of years before the pandemic. I think you can tell me if I'm wrong, but I think it was 2018 or 2017 was the most recent wave of the data we're working with. Is that right?
That does sound right, because, it was published in 21, but you're right, the data came out a few years before.
Yeah, so unfortunately, we really aren't able to see the rollout of some of those tools. And I think it's the case. I think there's some data that show this, that there was this really stark, quick uptake for a lot of these platforms during COVID. But before COVID, these were not really household platforms for a lot of older adults. So I am skeptical that it's really just Zoom on its own that might explain this. I mean, it may be, people certainly have used telephones for a long time and are able to connect that way. But I think there's a couple things happening there. So you mentioned kind of people that have what we called mid-range or long-range extended types of networks. And these are people, if we look at the sort of summary of all the different people who they say are important in their life, they tend to have at least a few people that are, I think we quantify it as more than 50 kilometers away as being kind of long distance. And I guess in miles in the States, you just multiply that by 0.62 or so, to get miles. But these are people that, they're at least a pretty, at least a car ride away. They're not people you can walk or cycle over to easily. And so what we found, though, is even if people are kind of characterized by having these long-ranging types of networks, oftentimes they do have at least one person maybe that also lives close by. And so it may be that they have their needs met in different ways. They can still stay connected, say, to adult children that have moved out of the town, maybe that took a job far away, maybe even outside the country, have moved across the Eurozone, even perhaps, and they're able to connect with them through technology or see them occasionally. But they're also able to meet some of their needs by, maybe a spouse that lives nearby or a romantic partner that maybe lives, in the same village or the same town. So that's one thing that I might help to explain why people as a whole, even if they have long-ranging networks, don't tend to report less satisfaction with their networks or less emotional closeness to their network as a whole, because they're kind of getting their needs met in different ways. The other thing I might say, though, is that if someone does have somebody who they name as part of their kind of close core network, and yet they live really far away, there's kind of a selection effect, I think, happening there, where the reason that they're naming them as important in their life is because they are really close emotionally to them. So their child, for instance, that moves from Greece to take the job, in Hungary, or moves all the way out to Germany, right, to work. They wouldn't have named that child as an important part of their network if they weren't talking to them regularly, if they weren't really emotionally attached to them. So I think what these findings show a little bit of is people can be pretty adaptive and pretty resilient in terms of if somebody that's close to them moves far away. People aren't willing to let those relationships go, right? It's important to them to keep that person in their life. And like you said, now that we've got better tools than ever, as the, whatever comes down the pike, whether it's the metaverse or holograms or other sort of technology that makes people even more lifelike from great distances, I don't expect that the distance is going to get any less, of a barrier maybe than it has been in the past.
Very cool. And that does make a lot of sense, especially, the selection effect and right. Kids, loved ones. It makes sense that distance, and you kind of mentioned it earlier that despite this being before COVID and yes, the huge uptick of all of a sudden everyone learning how to use Zoom or, Teams, that, people still had a way of connecting. So, it does make sense. I would be curious to see how, if at all, that has improved due to the technological advances and more or less that everyone, I'd say to a large extent, all age ranges becoming at least somewhat familiar or utilizing those connections to kind of help set up, these improved ways of maintaining some sort of connection that still has that personal touch. I mean, even was it like FaceTime on, iPhones now, right? So it's the various ways, to maintain, being able to just not just hear someone's voice, but see them face to face. So, okay, that does make a lot of sense. I think it's, something worth, continuing to watch and see how it expands and improves. And this kind of then leads me to the second finding really stood out to me, and y'all really highlight it, is y'all talk about proximate diverse networks with a strong representation of non-kin members nearby are less advantageous, even though they provide relatively frequent contact, but the lowest level of network satisfaction. So to me, this, and chat, case, y'all might be interested as well. This kind of reads as having, a multitude of friends or neighbors, if you could kind of elaborate on what helps constitute these kind of networks and why there's, satisfaction, even though they're, have frequent contact with them, may not be as meaningful as, again, it might seem obvious, a connection with a child or a loved one.
Yeah, we were actually a little surprised by the drop off in how satisfied people were with these proximal close by networks relative to other types of networks where people were more spread out. We actually kind of had anticipated that if you had clear people, and again, the way that people get into these networks to be considered part of the network was they have to be people that are important to you in some way. So you identify on this survey up to 7 people that are important to you in your life that you can go to if you want to talk to important matters, share good news, share bad news, people that are there for you. And we had kind of anticipated that, in these data, we would see, if you have a lot of people close by, then that's really going to have some benefits. And maybe, the satisfaction you have with your network as a whole would be pretty much on par with maybe having your family members that are at a distance. But you're right, it turned out that people were much more satisfied even with these longer ranging networks that included family members than they were with having, neighbors or close friends within 5 kilometers or so. And, you asked earlier about whether we would expect to see the same patterns in the United States. And this is one of those findings where actually I would like to compare it to the United States. I have a hunch that a lot of this, finding might be driven by these more familialistic types of cultures in maybe Southern Europe and Eastern Europe, where you do see a really pronounced importance of family. And maybe friends are fine and neighbors are fine for what they can do, but there seems to be some level of satisfaction that can only really be met, at least in the European context, by family members.
Yeah, that really, you kind of hit the nail on the head. Like, just to me, that seems so interesting, like the level, because, at least, and again, everyone excuse my naivety with just the idea, like, especially here in the US, you have families close. I guess it does depend to an extent how you're brought up, but especially once you go off to college, right? It's, your groups, your social grouping expectations, who you find yourself close with starts changing drastically, right? Becomes more associated with the friends. Once you start a career path, I'm not saying, you leave your family in the dust, not at all. But just like that level of closeness and having that interconnectedness, I was just surprised that, there's such a stark difference. I think that's really interesting. And again, echoing, I really would be curious to see how that would reflect on US, especially is it, how much does it vary by regions, East Coast, Central, good old here in Texas versus West Coast. So yeah, I really do. I think, the findings y'all had, I think it's great. And it's also one of those that raises a lot of questions, a lot of intrigue, which is one reason I love this field. There's always something more to add and explore.
Yeah, the US is pretty uncommon in terms of the geographic mobility. Like you said, a lot of times people go off to college and they leave Iowa and they go to New York City, or they, migrate down from California down here to Texas. And the Eurozone kind of enabled a lot more of that mobility across Europe, but there's still these kind of linguistic and cultural traditions that really make it challenging, I think, to move from a place like Spain up to Sweden, for instance, to take work. And some people make those kind of moves, but I think it's just a lot less common in terms of how prevalent that it would be in Europe.
Absolutely. Well, and not to mention language barriers, right? People, I think to an extent, rightfully so, give the US a lot of grief about not knowing geography, but that's because, Europe, instead of having states, right, you have all the different countries, but the amount of languages, right, needed to really, like I said, going from Greece to taking a job in Germany, that's going to be a major culture shock. I think to an extent, probably more than, if you went from, as you said, Idaho or Iowa to New York, yeah, there's going to be a culture shock, big city life, but just those kind of differences are really Yeah, have some questions popping up, but really, interesting. Really curious to see how that, kind of would pan out more so. I think kind of like catching along, going along with, this kind of, again, geographical networking seems to make sense. A lot of interest in comparisons with the US. So to that extent, use that as much as I can as a segue to this second article.